All right, so we're diving into something pretty heavy today, something that's, well, honestly, pretty terrifying.
Yeah, no kidding.
We're talking Iran-Israel missiles, like hundreds of missiles, and a conflict that
hmm
could easily get way out of hand.
Yeah, it's a seriously messy situation, and it's important to understand the background here, the history that's feeding into all of this.
Right, we're going to break down a recent analysis we saw that argues this whole thing could be like a tiny little spark that turns into, a massive inferno.
Exactly. And this isn't just some isolated border skirmish. This has the potential to explode into something much, much bigger.
Okay, so the analysis starts by setting the scene. Israeli forces launch what they're calling a limited incursion into southern Lebanon, which leads to direct clashes with Hezbollah.
And, right away, that's a recipe for trouble. Southern Lebanon has been this incredibly tense flashpoint between Israel and Hezbollah for decades.
Right, so why is southern Lebanon such a big deal?
Well, both sides see it as strategically crucial, so even the smallest incident there has the potential to spiral out of
It's
control.
like a powder keg just waiting for a spark.
Exactly, and this time it seems that spark came from Iran. The analysis claims they launched hundreds of Fate 1 ballistic missiles directly at Israel.
Hundreds. Like, I can't even wrap my head around that many missiles.
It's about sending a message, a show of force. Now, when we're talking about the Fate 1, it's not the biggest, most destructive ballistic missile out there. It's got a relatively small payload.
So then what's the point? If it's not about just blowing things up, what are they trying to achieve?
It's about psychological impact. Imagine you're in Israel and you see this massive barrage coming from Iran. It creates this sense of vulnerability, this feeling that nowhere is safe.
And the analysis shows impacts all over the place, not just military targets either. There's even footage of what looks like an offshore gas rig, completely engulfed in flames.
Right. It's about demonstrating that they can hit anything they want.
Mm-hmm.
Military targets, civilian infrastructure, even economic assets like that gas rig.
And hitting that gas rig, even if they didn't destroy it, completely sends a powerful message. We can hurt you economically too.
Absolutely. It adds a whole other layer to the conflict.
Mm.
Suddenly, it's not just about bombs and bullets. It's about impacting everyday life, creating fear and uncertainty on a much broader scale.
And that's where things start to get really interesting. And by interesting, I mean terrifying. But we'll get into that more right after this quick break. So before the break, we were talking about the sheer scale of this attack, and this is where the analysis gets really interesting. And by interesting, I mean kind of terrifying.
Yeah, this is where things get really real.
They argue that this attack exposed a major flaw in Israel's Iron Dome defense system.
Hmm.
The Iron Dome is supposed to be this impenetrable shield.
Right. It's world renowned.
Exactly. But
Yeah.
this attack, it just overwhelmed it. They just couldn't keep up with that many missiles at once.
It's the classic problem of saturation. You can have the best defense system in the world, but if you throw enough projectiles at it, something's going to get through.
Throwing enough mud at a wall, eventually some of it's going to stick.
Exactly. And when those projectiles are ballistic missiles, even one getting through can be devastating.
So does this change the whole game then? If a country like Iran can just launch this kind of massive attack and overwhelm even advanced defenses like the Iron Dome, does that change the strategic calculus?
It definitely raises some serious questions. Does this make preemptive strikes more likely? Does it mean countries need to invest even more heavily in defensive technologies? It's hard to say for sure, but it definitely has people thinking.
And then there's the nuclear factor. This analysis argues that when you add Iran's nuclear ambitions into the mix, this attack starts to look like a death sentence for Israel.
It's a scary thought for sure, and I understand why people would make that connection, but I think it's important to be cautious about jumping to conclusions.
So you're saying don't hit the panic button just yet.
Exactly. We have to look at this situation from all angles. There's always more to the story.
Like those reports coming out of Iran claiming they destroyed 20 Israeli F-35 fighter jets. 20. That sounds like a major victory if it's true.
Right, and that's a big if. We haven't seen any independent verification of those claims, and even the Iranians admit that the information is still preliminary.
So how do we sort through all the noise? How do we know what to believe in a situation like this?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's more important than ever to be critical of the information we're consuming, to look for multiple sources, and to try to understand the biases involved.
Let's try and find a needle in a haystack,
Oh.
except the haystack is on fire.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
It's messy and it's complicated, but that's why we're here to try to make sense of it all.
So we're left with this huge question mark hanging over everything. What happens next? What does Israel do?
Well, that's what's keeping a lot of people up at night right now. This attack put Israel in a really tough spot. They can't just let it slide, but any response could make things a whole lot worse.
Yeah, it's a delicate balancing act for sure.
Absolutely. And you have to remember the bigger picture here. This is a region that's already on edge. There are so many different players with their own interests and agendas. One wrong move could set off a chain reaction that nobody can control.
So let's talk about those potential moves. What are Israel's options here? Could they respond in a way that doesn't escalate things further?
Well, some analysts are suggesting targeted strikes against Iranian military assets, focus on the facilities directly involved in the missile launch. That sends a message without necessarily provoking all-out war.
But would that be enough to deter Iran in the future?
That's the big question. Some people think that if Iran is willing to launch an attack like this with their current capabilities, they might be even bolder if they develop nuclear weapons.
Which brings us to that terrifying possibility of a preemptive strike against Iran's nuclear program.
It's a dangerous game, but it's one that some people are talking about. If Israel feels like its existence is truly threatened, they might feel like they have no other choice.
And that's where things could spiral out of control very quickly. We go from a border clash to a regional war to potentially even a global nuclear conflict.
It's a chilling thought, and it highlights just how important diplomacy is in a situation like this. The international community needs to step up and find a way to de-escalate the situation before it's too late.
It's a heavy reality to grapple with. We started by talking about a border clash, and now we're talking about the potential for global nuclear war. It's hard to even wrap your head around.
It's a lot to process for sure, but it underscores just how interconnected our world is. What happens in one corner of the globe can have repercussions that ripple outwards and impact all of us.
Well said. It's a sobering reminder that peace is fragile and that we all have a role to play in preserving it.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you for joining us today and for sharing your expertise on this incredibly complex and concerning situation. Your insights have been invaluable.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us for another deep dive into the most pressing issues facing our world. We'll continue to follow this story closely and keep you updated as the situation develops. Until then, stay informed, stay engaged, and let's all work together to build a more peaceful future.